What is this housing crisis we think of, and why do we think the market is going to make it better? And secondly, what can we expect the housing market to do, and how can our policies change the outcomes?
House prices are too high, and rents are shooting up. Developers are declaring bankruptcy before finishing new homes, leaving new owners stranded. And there's the lack of quality and availability for both rental and social housing. My name is Matt Lloyd-Cape, and I'm the director of the Centre for Equitable Housing, an initiative of Per Capita. Our team has been researching the impact of poor housing for the past 15 years. And over that time, we've seen the Australian housing system come under increasing pressure, uncovered some damning trends, and heard the heartbreaking stories of those affected, as well as talking to housing academics, researchers, and organisations who are seeking to find lasting solutions to our housing issues. This is Homes Not Houses, an investigative podcast recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, which puts the housing system under the microscope and examines the factors which exacerbate inequality across the nation. Join us for this 6-part series where we unpack the current housing crisis, how we got here, who wins and loses from the current system, what sort of better housing system could we have, and how we can get there. Part 3. How did we get here? The great Australian dream of home ownership is on life support. The rental market is in a shambles, and social housing has been callously neglected for so long, waiting lists now stretch for 10 years. All of these factors are pushing many people into significant housing stress. But how exactly did we get here?
And now A.B. Jennings presents The Elite. For all of you who think you can't afford a big new home, it comes complete with a large number of luxury extras, and they're all included in the incredibly low price.
While there have always been problems with the housing system, particularly for Indigenous Australians, from the 1950s to the 1990s, home ownership was more affordable, so was rent, and there was ample social housing stock too. In short, the Australian dream was alive and well.
Living with Mum and Dad, I saved the deposit for my own place.
So what do you think? You like it?
Yeah. And then I talked to the National about owning it as soon as possible. It's great.
So, you're effectively owning your own home 7 years soon.
But it took a bit of work to get here in the first place. At the turn of the 20th century, following Federation, many Aussies lived in poor quality houses, with slums being a feature of many capital cities.
1929. The financial house of cards collapses, and the overinflated stock market plunges into a Great Depression.
Prior to the Second World War, state administrators, rather than the Commonwealth government, were predominantly responsible for the provision of social housing. It was up to the state governments to answer the call for greater protections for renters during the Great Depression. Some estimates of unemployment during the Great Depression were as high as 30%, the highest unemployment rate in Australian history. For context, that unemployment rate peaked at 7% in 2020. Back then, though, we lacked the basic social safety nets that we take for granted today. However, government stepped up. The Lang government in New South Wales passed bills such as the Reduction of Rents Act and the Ejectment Postponement Bill of 1931, which acted as rent control and prevented evictions, reducing homelessness. In 1938, the Victorian government passed legislation to facilitate a war on slums. The Housing Commission was tasked with excising slum pockets for the common good. The Commission built flats to rehouse the slum dwellers. At the same time, it went about acquiring cheap land in suburbs such as Coburg, Brunswick, Northcote, Fitzroy and Richmond. It's worth mentioning, however, that these reforms weren't always popular or permanent. The Ejectment Bill was repealed in 1932 and the Reduction of Rents Act later adapted to favour landlords. The slum clearance programs in inner Melbourne were highly controversial and often residents refused to move, meaning that slum clearance remained an issue for the Housing Commission into the 1950s and 60s. As World War II unfolded, the need for a national approach became evident. In 1940, the Menzies government introduced national rent control as a temporary measure to prevent rent increases during the wartime. Wartime price controls were then extended in 1942 by the Curtin government to strengthen rent control and fix the price of homes and land to no more than 10% above what was considered a fair and reasonable price.
The war is over. The planes are put away. The men who served in the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force are looking for peacetime jobs. Their application forms, men served on the battlefronts of 4 oceans look towards Australia as a country in which they have a hope and a future.
Despite both state and Commonwealth efforts, housing continued to be an issue post-war, with increased migration, returning servicemen, and residual housing shortages from the war and the Depression. When the Chifley government came to power in 1945, it did so with the explicit aim to ensure each Australian had a place to call home. Heavy investments were made in growing and housing the population. Incentives were put in place for new housing developments, both for buyers and social tenants, and a new intergovernmental agreement, the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, was introduced in order to make up the shortfall in supply. The agreement emerged as part of a range of Keynesian post-war policies aimed at improving satisfactory housing for all Australian residents. It posited, "A dwelling of good standard and equipment is not only the need, but the right of every citizen, whether the dwelling is to be rented or purchased." This historic agreement is thought to have provided much of the institutional, financial and policy framework for the operation of social housing in Australia over the coming decades. And while the agreement was renewed for the final time in 2003, it acted as the principal policy instrument for ensuring housing affordability for lower income renters and home buyers for much of the 20th century. Through the provision of cheap loans to the states and territories, the number of government-built dwellings completed each year rose from 4,000 in 1946 to 14,000 in 1955. This led to over 96,000 dwellings being built through the first Commonwealth State Housing Agreement operation.
So following the war, when Ben Chifley was in charge, they created the Commonwealth Housing Commission.
That's Alan Kohler, who spoke to Per Capita late last year as part of our webinar series.
They started off with Commonwealth State Housing Agreements where the Commonwealth was paying for the states to build public housing. And there was a huge amount of public housing built during that time. And it did continue after Menzies became Prime Minister in 1949, but not for long.
A feature of Whyalla is its modern homes, which a worker can rent cheaply from the BHP or purchase on easy terms. Public buildings are large and modern. Unique is the Town Commission, which handles all administration. The Commission is about to issue a challenge to the rest of Australia. Through the town's newspaper, the Commission throws down the gauge to all other towns, irrespective of size or geographical situation.
The post-war reconstruction explicitly focused on providing public rental housing for working families. And throughout the following 30 years, government housing construction rates remained very high by today's standards, averaging around 10,000 new dwellings every year. Both sides of politics remain committed to the regime of construction, even though their preferences for renters versus homeowner support varied over that time.
Would you say that Australia was still a land of opportunity for those who wish to go there?
Well, I will, of course, tremendous opportunity.
And people don't need a great deal of capital to start?
Well, I think the greatest capital that people need is a willingness to work and take a chance, just as our grandparents did when they came to Australia.
This idea that you only needed your labour to earn enough to buy a house contributed to the reputation of Australia as a working man's paradise. It took just a couple of years to save for a 20% deposit compared to around 10 or 11 years now. State-based provision of rental housing was increasingly portrayed by the media and government as stifling necessary private investment in housing, with home ownership seen as preferable to public housing tenancy.
What Menzies did was kind of two-sided in the sense that he did promote home ownership, but it was for self-interested reasons. because he believed, possibly with some justification, that renters voted Labor and homeowners voted Liberal. And so he wanted to make sure that there were as many homeowners as possible. And so what he did was he forced the states to start selling the public housing that had been built after the war. And there was a huge amount of public housing built during that time. And it did continue after Menzies became Prime Minister in 1949, but not for long. And he started to force the states to sell that housing, firstly to the tenants and then secondly to anybody who wanted them. And the idea simply was, as you said, to create what he thought was a nation of little capitalists. The idea of public housing, government-owned housing, government-built housing that is rented at favourable terms to people who need it, started to go away, and was I think finally killed off by Malcolm Fraser. But the other thing that I think is kind of important in terms of what Menzies did was he embedded this idea that home ownership is good and renting is bad. And so, he kind of in many speeches talked about how it should be the great Australian aspiration to have a little plot of your own and, that nobody can kick you out of and all this stuff.
In 1956, the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement was renewed. The new agreement allowed for the sale of state-owned housing to sitting tenants and diverted 30% of Commonwealth funding towards home purchasers' assistance.
From Britain and the ports of Europe, ships are bringing migrants and new settlers to help fill the vacant spaces and vacant jobs in Australia. No problem facing this country is greater than that of getting people, hundreds of thousands of people, into the Commonwealth each year. Their coming is vital to the future security, growth and development of this nation.
During the post-war immigration drive of 1945 to 1965, 2 million people migrated to Australia. This resulted in a rapidly growing workforce. However, many people were diverted into construction, such as in infrastructure and house building. Around that time, regulations and permissions for self-builders and their ability to access cheap land near the city centres led to a boom in people building their own homes.
Whyalla has the highest birth rate in Australia. Its population of 8,000 includes 2,000 children. The maternity hospital is a splendid modern building which would shame many a city. Almost a baby a day is born here. 1,580 since 1940. For every death in the town in the past 6 years, 100 babies have been born.
Coinciding with immigration, a post-war baby boom added to Australia's rapidly growing population, with the population reaching 10 million in 1959. Over the 1970s, public housing became increasingly difficult to access as stricter means tests were introduced. This moved the concept of what public housing was for away from its original ideal of housing workers towards housing people out of work. Australia's population continued to grow, reaching 15 million in 1981. During the 1980s, investment in new public housing stagnated, and programs for renters in the private rental market, like Commonwealth Rent Assistance, were rapidly expanded and reformed. Various changes were made to the payment eligibility criteria, like in 1986, when eligibility was extended to unemployed people, and then to low-income families in 1987. The expansion of Commonwealth Rent Assistance is thought to have represented a national housing policy transition away from government supplying new affordable homes towards subsidising individual tenants in the private rental market. As expenditure on rent assistance grew, allocation of funds towards the Commonwealth State Housing Agreements and their programs within, such as public housing construction, were reduced. Between 1984 and 1993, assistance provided from the Commonwealth to the states and territories fell by approximately 25% in real terms. Meanwhile, Australia was experiencing a period of financial deregulation, which changed the way that banks could provide mortgages to both home buyers and investors. The twin processes of financialisation and government withdrawal from providing housing would have roll-on effects for decades to come. In fact, we're still feeling them now.
in September 1999, the Howard government halved the capital gains tax by changing the way that capital gains tax is calculated from being inflation adjusted, so that from 1985, when the capital gains tax was introduced, basically what happened was from that time, you added the capital gain to your income for tax purposes, minus the impact of the consumer price index for the years that you owned the asset. And in September 1999, that was chucked out, and they brought in instead a straight out discount whereby you only paid tax on half of the capital gain. And after 2000, when capital gains tax was discounted by half, everyone jumped into it. So it became a huge thing.
These financialisation processes dehumanised the housing market, turning homes into commodified assets. More and more people began to think about housing in terms of capital growth, instead of thinking about shelter and home building. While incentives to invest in housing were supposed to stimulate construction, most of this new investment actually went to buying existing homes rather than building new ones. Between 1985 and 2005, investment in housing shifted from 60% going to construction and 40% to buying existing homes, to 90% buying existing dwellings and just 10% going to new construction. This massively increased competition for first-time buyers, who are now competing against investors who could tax deduct their mortgages through negative gearing. While many of the banking reforms were aimed at expanding access to home ownership, they have instead led to dramatically increased house prices and increased the home ownership gap between the young and old and the rich and poor. The Commonwealth State Housing Agreement was renewed for the final time in 2003, with the Howard government making significant cuts to social housing funding, at the same time as removing accountability for the states to report on how they were spending their Commonwealth funding on public housing. The Commonwealth State Housing Agreement was replaced by the National Affordable Housing Agreement by the Rudd government, against the backdrop of the GFC as part of the stimulus strategy to prevent a recession. The federal government's social housing initiative was introduced as part of the government's National Build Economic Stimulus Plan. Over the following 3 years, 19,000 new social dwellings were built, and maintenance work was carried out on an additional 12,000 rundown public housing dwellings, making them accessible for tenants again. However, the National Affordable Housing Agreement did not build in long-term planning and funding to maintain this level of investment. And while similar in concept to previous federal-state agreements, the National Affordable Housing Agreement has been criticised for failing to address the multifaceted drivers of housing affordability and housing insecurity. Critics argue that it lacks a whole-of-system approach, and factors such as mental health, disability, domestic violence, taxation, infrastructure provision and planning were not considered in it.
Because Australia is facing an unfolding national and international economic emergency, the Government of Australia is today launching an unprecedented $42 billion nation-building and jobs plan to support jobs and to invest in Australia's long-term economic future.
While the 2008 global financial crisis sent many markets reeling, Australia navigated the GFC relatively unscathed. In fact, the crisis drove down interest rates, and for a long time they stayed very low. Alongside the commodities boom, low interest rates triggered another housing boom. And for a while, people's mortgages remained relatively stable despite house prices continuing to grow. That is, until COVID.
Good evening. There was plenty of shock and awe from the Reserve Bank today as it defied market forecasts and the predictions of most experts, raising the cash rate another 0.25%. The news a bitter blow for mortgage holders and only worsened by the RBA boss warning more could be needed with inflation still too high.
Despite dire predictions of a housing market crash, house prices increased by a shocking 25% in less than 2 years by February 2022. This signalled a fundamental shift in the way in which we use our national housing stock. And much of these effects have actually lasted, with people working from home far more frequently and being willing to pay more, for example, to build a home office or to buy a bigger home than they would have previously. Many people moved out of shared homes and the proportion of people living alone increased significantly. Because of these new usage patterns, rent prices were also increasing prior to the opening of the border, and the very large numbers of returning migrants has contributed to higher rents. And then along came inflation, stemming from supply chain issues and the invasion of Ukraine. The RBA, along with other central banks, used the only tool that they have, which is to raise interest rates, which they did a whopping 13 times between May 2022 and November 2023. But despite being effectively one of the biggest housing policymakers in Australia, the RBA is not required to consider the impact of interest rate changes on the housing market when increasing or decreasing interest rates to combat inflation.
In recent history, the low interest rate environment has enabled serviceability to be manageable, but it's not as if it's been extraordinarily low. CoreLogic's affordability data has suggested that it has still been sitting over 30% for much of the 2010s. And now you have the double whammy of a rapidly rising interest rate environment and a further upswing in property values. So especially for recent home buyers, it really is a pretty disappointing circumstance where they would have finally been able to overcome this deposit hurdle and are now facing relatively high housing costs because of the rapid increase in interest rates.
The impact of these rate hikes rippled through the market. Average mortgage payments increased by 40%. And to make things harder for low-income renters, landlords increased rents to cover their growing mortgage costs.
That state of the rental market, undeveloped, has facilitated and it also reflects the perception of housing as assets. You know, it's allowed owners of investment properties to manipulate or to use the asset as an asset without having to consider that it's someone's home. Really, they just, even though that person is paying most of their mortgage. That's certainly an area. Like, that was an area we should have been dealing with anyway too. And now that more people are renting, it's become more prominent. It's certainly another piece, isn't it? That because we all expected to own a home, the rental was a step in that direction. So we didn't really pay much attention to it. And it's not a well-developed market, is it? It's not well regulated. There's no security, there's no stability, and there's no standards and enforcement. I mean, it's not true to say there are no standards. There are weak standards and enforcement, and all the onus, most of the onus is on tenants, to approach landlords. And of course, in a context of weak rights, you have no leverage. So a lot of people, we all know the stories of the mouldy walls and leaking and no heating and stuff, and that's not okay. That's heading towards, taking us towards two classes of Australians.
And then there's the way that the federal government manages housing policy and budgets. Every year, billions of dollars are dispensed through the federal budget on direct support to households and housing service providers. This includes Commonwealth rent assistance, social housing, homelessness services, help to buy schemes, Indigenous housing, and defence housing. So it might surprise you to hear that we do not actually have a specialised Department of Housing, nor is there any cohesive federal housing policy documentation that properly details all government expenditure on housing or that seeks to evaluate different kinds of programs. So it might surprise you to hear that we do not actually have a specialised Department of Housing, nor is there any cohesive federal housing policy documentation that properly details all government expenditure on housing or that seeks to evaluate different schemes against each other. The Howard government of 1996 abolished the position of Minister for Housing and reduced the Housing Department to a branch within the Social Security Ministry. Because of this, it's incredibly difficult for the public or even policymakers to understand whether our tax and transfer system is operating effectively in the housing system. Our research at the CEH has found that in 2023, total direct and indirect spending on housing was worth around $27 billion. However, investor tax breaks took up a large proportion of that, around 5 times that spent by the federal government on social housing and homelessness services. We also know that the share of federal housing spending going to the lowest fifth of households by income declined from 44% to 23% in the last 30 years. Meanwhile, the share going to the top fifth of households by income jumped from 9% to 43%. Australia is one of a small number of countries which has unrestricted negative gearing, and every country which allows property investors to offset rental losses against other income has seen a stagnation or a decline in home ownership. It's a lot to digest, but this complicated hodgepodge of uncoordinated poor policy decisions, a lack of oversight, global economic crisis, and a free marketeer mentality is what has got us here. Join us next week as we take a look at how Australia stacks up against the rest of the world. I'm Lloyd-Cape, and this has been Homes, Not Houses.